Alright everyone, so One Piece chapter 1139 just dropped, and we finally got to meet Scopper Gaban. We first saw this guy all the way back in chapter 19 during Buggy's flashback, so it has quite literally been 27 years that we've been waiting for this guy to show up. And this also solves the 14-year mystery of who that guy was with Crocus in that cover story, so all things considered, this is a pretty insane reveal. And now there's a whole lot to say about how this duel between Scopper and Luffy might go down, as well as what information Scopper might give us, especially pertaining to God Valley since he was there. But what I want to focus more on first is this Mountain Eater story, because I think there's a good chance that where that happened was Drum Kingdom. Now, this is a theory that I've seen floating around both in my Discord as well as Reddit and other places, and I wasn't really sure about it given the TCB translation, so I waited till the official came out, and I thought that one was a bit more ambiguous, at least in terms of where it was, and I think that opens the door that it could be Drum Kingdom. Because in the TCB, what they say is, that man accompanied him to a hospital deep within the mountains, which I kind of immediately read as like the Elbaf Mountains, because they're obviously already there, and when you say deep within the mountains, it kind of feels like there's some familiarity there. And then they didn't really talk about where this happened after that, but in the official they did. Now first they say, so he and this other fellow went to a hospital in the mountains, so they got rid of the deep within part, which to me is maybe a little bit more ambiguous. It's not a huge change, but the big factor for me is what they say later, because he says, but there's more. In the place where he fought, there was only the bald mountainside left behind. Now, the fact that he's saying it that way, in the place where he fought, feels like it could be a totally different island. It feels a lot more ambiguous than what we had in the TCB, at least to me. Now, obviously, they're both a little bit ambiguous, I guess, but the official more so, I think. And I usually lean towards the official for things like this because, I mean, they are the official, right? And so that opened the door for Drum Kingdom because, as you may recall, the mountains in Drum sure looked a lot like tree stumps, right? And at the end of that arc, whenever the Cherry Blossom Cannon happened, it kind of made one of those stumps look like a Sakura tree, right? Because it had that pink mist in the sky. And I think that kind of hinted that those may have been Sakura trees at one point, but they got cut down. And I think we might be learning now that Scopper was the one who did that. And I think it would make a lot of sense because obviously Kureha is a doctor, and we heard that Roger was recuperating, so he would have needed to go to a doctor, presumably. But also remember, Kureha was the first person to bring up the Will of D, and the fact that Gold Roger's real name is Gold D Roger. So how would she know that if she didn't meet them before? But here's where that theory gets really, really deep, in my opinion. Because look at these two. They have the same pair of glasses pretty much. And on top of that, and shout out to Miles in the Discord for bringing this up, we stole a key from Kureha, which is kind of an inversion of Scopper keeping a key from us. And maybe my favorite part of this entire thing, we obviously met Chopper during this arc, who was named that by Hiriluck because he had strong looking horns that could even bring down a tree. And obviously Chopper rhymes with Scopper, which could be its own hint, but I'm kind of just wondering if Kureha is related to Scopper. Maybe her name is literally Scopper Kureha. And now to be clear, I don't think that Scopper would be her son because she is 141 years old. And that would mean that Scopper, if we presume he's around 60 or 70, which I think is accurate, then that would mean that she had Scopper when she was 70 or 80. And now for most people, I would say it's a done deal that ain't gonna happen. For Kureha, I guess there is a chance, because I mean, she's 141 and we don't know what the secret is, so who knows? But I think given the context, it might be more likely that she's just Scopper's grandma. And if that's true, Oda, you're just absolutely cooking. I don't know what else to say. Because I always kind of presumed that the trees at Drum Kingdom were cut down like during the Void Century. Maybe it was something really important. But if Scopper did it, I mean, that's just kind of hype, man. I don't know what else to say. And this also ties to something that I saw in my YouTube comments from Matthew Leader, where he brought up that maybe Scopper cutting down those trees could potentially be a tie to what we saw in Skypiea. Because if you recall, Nolan cut down all the sacred trees there because they were making people sick. And there are tons of Skypiea connections to Elbaf right now. And I fully expect that Nolan's going to get mentioned in a major way sometime soon. So if Oda's going for a parallel there, I think that would be beautiful. Now, I don't think it would be an exact parallel. I almost think it could be an inversion, because we were told during Drum Kingdom from Kureha and Hiriluck that there was a place with Sakura trees that could heal people, right? We were told that Hiriluck was there before. So given the Cherry Blossom trees' ties to healing people, I think it might be the opposite. I mean, what if the Sakura trees helped heal people, but Scopper had to cut them down to protect his captain? And so again, get kind of a reverse situation. Like, what if Drum got really mad at Roger and Scopper because of that, kind of like Calgara got mad at Noland, and maybe that's a plot line that we still have to develop somehow. And I gotta say, Oda introducing Scopper during this arc, who's named the Mountain Eater, who uses axes, who cut down a bunch of giant trees, while we have the Atom Tree over here, which is super important to all the giants, and giants even live on it, I think is mega ominous. Because I've been saying for years at this point that the Atom Tree is gonna have to fall down one way or the other, and the fact we're meeting like the best tree cutter in the world during this arc is not a good sign. Or a good sign for my theory, I guess, but you know what I mean. Poor giants. And given that live action season 2 is right around the corner, I'm down for any Drum Kingdom hype that Oda can give us. But now I think we need to ask what we're actually going to learn from Scopper here in the near future and how this battle with Luffy is going to go down. But I want to start by talking about the fact that we met Scopper right in front of one of these summoning circles. It's actually the first time that the crew got to have a good look at one of those. And I think the fact that the circle is still here after they use the summoning is going to be a very important plot point, I think. Like, was this circle here even before the Gods Knights just arrived, thus showing how they were able to summon here at all? Because in Egghead, Saturn said that he had to perform the summoning. That kind of seemed to imply that you need someone there to make the circle in order to bring you there. So I'm wondering how this circle ever got there in the first place. Like, was this here way back from when Harold died? Or did somebody maybe sneak in and make it for them? I don't know. And what happens if the crew destroys this thing? Would the Gods Knights maybe get sent back? I think all of those elements are going to make for a very interesting plot here inside the castle before we leave. But the reason why this circle is relevant to Gaban specifically is twofold. One, like I said before, he was at God Valley. That's where we saw the Gods Knights performing that native cleansing. So he already knows these guys and can likely give us a hint about how their powers work, since he's likely seen it before and maybe even defeated it before. And I think that alone could be helpful as its own type of training for Luffy, since Luffy's going to be fighting people who use these circles for most of the rest of the story, probably. And that all ties me to the second point, which is how Shamrock told us last chapter that he's gonna bring in another Gods Knight. So that means that we should be having a Gods Knight appear at this circle in the midst of the Gaban and Luffy battle for the key. And I think that alone could provide a great test for Luffy, as well as a great learning opportunity for all of us and the crew. I mean, maybe Gaban just knows the actual secret to beating them, kind of like how Brook told us about the salt during Thriller Bark to beat the zombies. Or maybe Gaban at least knows how the circles work generally speaking, even if he can't beat them, so we kind of know what we're up against. Whatever it ends up being, there's a lot of possibilities here, and I think what happens inside this castle is going to be insane. And as for what Gods Knight might come out of that circle, I feel very, very confident that it's going to be this guy, because we saw a kid with a mask just like his at Mother Carmel's House of Lambs 63 years ago. And then at God Valley, we saw a Gods Knight with a mask just like his, which was 38 years ago. Now, obviously, he'd be kind of old at this point. He'd be in like his late 60s or so, which seems to be how old Garling is, so there might be a connection there. But regardless, I think if he reappears in Elbaf, where his orphanage used to be, and he goes around helping Shamrock to round up children specifically, because that's their goal now, that would just be an incredibly deep plot line to me. Because it would be like the Gods Knights are now perpetuating the very same system they were victims of, right? Because he basically was one of the kids that he is now rounding up. Now, obviously there's a little bit of difference there because he was an orphan in that orphanage and all these kids seem to be with their parents. But regardless, you kind of get the point. And I wonder if we might get some reflection from him maybe? Maybe he'll go around thinking about how messed up this is and that he shouldn't be doing this. Maybe he won't want to perpetuate everything that's been happening because he doesn't like the life that he's been forced into. But what I really want is that if that guy shows up, I really hope that Scopper remembers him. And I think that alone could make for its own interesting plot line. I mean, maybe they fought back at God Valley and they kind of reminisce over that. Maybe that's even how Oda gets into the next stage of that God Valley flashback. And that potential fight leads me to my next point, which is about what Scopper might teach Luffy during their fight. Because Rayleigh trained Luffy during the time skip. And the main thing that Rayleigh was teaching Luffy was about Haki, and mainly the fundamentals of it. He didn't really have a chance to teach the advanced advanced applications because the time crunch of the time skip, he had to hurry up and teach Luffy all that kind of stuff. And also Luffy was still learning the basics, so learning advanced applications is kind of hard. And I think the biggest thing is that we've learned time and time again that Haki blooms in battle. And that is really, really hard to replicate during a training scenario, right? Like, Rayleigh's not actually going to be out there trying to kill Luffy. So I think now that Luffy has learned a lot of the advanced applications, it makes a lot of sense for Scopper to come in and help him finalize that, and maybe even learn a thing or two that he doesn't already know, so that Luffy can get even to another level than he's already at. Because Luffy's learned a lot of his advanced applications on the fly, right? I mean, he has had teachers, but you look back to the Katakuri fight, he was kind of learning it on his own based off what Katakuri was saying. And then he obviously had Hyogoro to teach him Ryo during the Udon prison, which really helped. But then even during the rooftop battle, he kind of picked up on advanced conquerors on his own against Kaido, right? So even though Luffy has a great grasp of the fundamentals and a decent grasp of the advanced parts of it, I think Gaban can still come in and teach him some truly top level stuff. And despite the Mountain Eater story, I think Gaban is a lot more likely to teach Luffy some new observation techniques than armament. Now, obviously conquerors will be involved as well. In fact, I think it's going to be how you mix conquerors with observation, but I just think it's more likely than armament because Gaban is very obviously a Sanji parallel, right? He's the left hand of the Pirate King, he loves women, he already had a kid with Ripley, they already made a joke about Sanji in regards to Scopper, and we know that Sanji leans towards observation Haki. And now Sanji can still use armament, it's just that he's better at observation, kind of like how Zoro's better at armament and how Luffy has a natural penchant for conquerors, right? And I think so far what we've mostly seen from conquerors is that you kind of use it like armament Haki, right? You kind of just use it to make your attacks even stronger. But I think we still need to see how you can use conquerors with observation. And I think our best hint towards this is something that we saw in Volume 4 Billion, where we heard that Shanks can cancel other people's observation Haki. And now we haven't even seen this in action to my knowledge, and this is the only place we've ever heard of this ability, but if there was a time to learn it, it's probably now because Shanks' brother is on the island. And we also know that Scopper asked Luffy what he's going to do if Loki gets free and doesn't do what he wants, and he said that he'll just lock him back up. And Scopper said that Shanks was the only guy who was able to do that, so I think that Gaban is making sure that Luffy is on Shanks' level, and maybe canceling observation Haki will be a part of that. And I just think it makes a lot of sense that Scopper would be one of, if not the best at observation Haki in the world, so if there's somebody who's going to teach it to Luffy, it should be him. So when it comes to this potential fight between Luffy and Gaban, I think what might happen here is that Scopper's future sight is just so good, he might be able to avoid Luffy as much as he wants. Maybe even going as far to force Luffy to hit that Gear 5th time limit, right? And then that would kind of teach Luffy that he can't always be in a battle of attrition. It would force him to learn how to end his battles quicker, or at least how to fight without using Gear 5th all the time. Because there's probably a lot of combatants who can just waste the clock so that Luffy can't win. And personally, I would really love if this were to happen, because while Gear 5th is amazing and super powerful, obviously, we should have more of a focus on the drawbacks. I mean, during the rooftop, Luffy went out and back into Gear 5th on Will alone, and during Egghead, it seemed like every time he got tired, he found food immediately. I mean, we had the mystery person feeding him, who is basically guaranteed to be Kizaru at this point, and then he also got the fermented meat from the giants, and then he went and ate even more on the giant ship. So I pray that Oda allows the drawbacks to finally matter, so that Luffy is then pushed to improve in other ways than Gear 5th, and then he can explore all the different branches of conquerors that we haven't seen him use yet. That would kind of show Luffy that Gear 5th isn't the end-all be-all as amazing as it is. And I just feel like forcing Luffy to learn that in order to get the key to free Loki would just be a perfect time. But now I want to go ahead and touch on a few other smaller points in the chapter before I get to your guys' questions. And first, I want to start with Gaban bringing up the mixed races in the One Piece world, specifically the Dosendatas, because that is not a group that we've ever heard before. And at least from what I've seen, it feels like most people have fallen into two camps on this. One is that it's a hybrid between Fishmen and Tentada, or the other option, which is my preferred one, is that it's a hybrid between a giant and a Tentada. And we've actually met a Fishman before named Dosen, like in the name Dosendata, but he was a hammerhead shark because Dosen is the onomatopoeia for a loud thud. So given that context, I think the Dosen part could tie more to the giant, since as they walk around, they'd make really loud thuds, I guess. And then the Data part at the end sounds a lot like the end of Tentada, so I think that part is pretty much locked in. But if you're wondering if a Tentada could even have kids with giants, or fishmen for that matter, well, Big Mom did it, so nothing's off the table. And then the other thing I'd like to touch touch on is that there's a lot of speculation right now that Scopper could be the man marked by flames. And now, obviously nothing is confirmed yet, but I do think the reveal of Scopper here actually hurts his case as man marked by flames, despite that scar that we see on his face. And that's because the man marked by flames is supposed to be on an all-black ship creating whirlpools right now. So it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense for him to be here on Elbaf just chilling if that's the case. Especially given the fact that we know he's spent a lot of time here over the last 20 years, since he had Colin with Ripley. So could Oda make that all work logistically and have him be the man marked by flames? I mean, sure, there's probably some way that Oda could rope that all together, but I don't think the context does him a lot of favors right now. And then the very last thing that I want to touch on before we get to your guys' questions is what happened at the very beginning of the chapter, which was in the cover story. Because we saw that Who's Who has detained 2 people with horns, and I think those 2 almost have to be Ulti and Page 1. The silhouette on the left looks to me like Page 1 because he had that bucket hat thing, and it kind of looks similar here a little bit, and then Ulti would be over on the right. And I think where this whole thing is going is that Yamato is going to defeat Who's Who, thus claiming Page 1 and Ulti as retainers, in a very similar way to how Odin went around Wano and got his retainers by protecting them all those years ago. And then I also think that what's going to happen is Yamato is going to beat Who's Who, which then acts as an Ashura Doji parallel. Because Doji was the big boss of Curry for a while during the Odin flashback, and Odin had to go in and defeat him and turn that whole area around. That led Doji to then respect Odin and join him as a scabbard. So I think that same kind of thing is going to happen here with Yamato. And it's very interesting that all these people are joining Yamato after they were following Kaido, given that Yamato is Kaido's son. But now I want to go ahead and get into some of your guys' comments. And first up is from Oblivion Folder asking, do you think we will get Scopper Gaban's God Valley flashback? We've only gotten God Valley stuff when a living character matters in God Valley. And I know that we discussed some of the Gaban and God's Night potential outcomes earlier, but we didn't really talk about what that flashback specifically might show us, which is why I really like this question. Because even though we saw some bits of God Valley in chapters 1095 and 1096, and we got some of the backdrop to it from Sengoku over 100 chapters before that, there's still a ton of missing information. I mean, namely, did they use those summoning circles while they were there? How exactly did Rox die? And did he actually die? Because we know in One Piece, if there's no body, then there's no death. And when they say that God Valley got erased, do they mean like Leloucia? Or is there still a chunk of it remaining somewhere in what might be Thriller Bark? And obviously there's a lot more to the flashback than just that, but those are some of the things that we still need to see. And as for Scopper, my guess is that he's going to give us a little bit of that flashback, but not the whole thing. I think the full God Valley flashback is something that like Shiki or Wang Ji or some amalgamation of the Rocks pirates should tell us, since that is where their crew ended, right? And where their captain supposedly died. But what I do think Scopper can give us some insight to is into the Roger pirate side of things. I mean, at a bare minimum, he could show us how they ended up with the chest that had Shanks in it and why they named him and all that kind of stuff, which would be pretty appropriate since Shamrock is here at Elbaf, right? But what I really want from Scopper is to explain what he meant during God Valley when he told Roger that he can't call captains dibs this time. Because I think the base level implication here is that Scopper wanted some type of treasure for himself, but when he says this time, it kind of indicates that Roger may have called dibs before, right? And I've always really wondered what that could be about. I mean, maybe it's just about some random one-off treasure and it's not a big deal, but if there was someone to explain what that was all about, it should be Scopper, and he is here, so maybe that'll work. But then as for our next question, Growth Stonks asked if Scopper has been raising Roger's egg for the last 20 years, and also what exactly is in that egg. A dragon, a phoenix, a thunderbird like from Strong World? And I think this is a very good question because Roger's egg is still a giant mystery. It hasn't even been seen since the crew disbanded, and we didn't even really know that much about it before that anyway. And I mean, we've only seen that egg on the Oro Jackson and nowhere else. And here in Elbaf, we have the Adam Tree, which the Oro Jackson is made of, so I think in the grander context of the story, it might make sense to find both the Oro Jackson and the egg here at the very same time. I mean, I don't know where else we would find it, so Elbaf makes some sense, I think. And maybe Gaban has been guarding it, sort of like Kuma guarded the Sunny during the time skip. But as for what's in that egg specifically, I definitely think it's going to be a dragon. That's something that I've broken down on the main channel a couple times, and will be again soon for a Uranus video, but it's mainly all because I think inside that egg egg is Uranus, or at least one of the parts to Uranus. And this is because during the Ed War, Shiki was telling Roger that they should join hands and that he knows Roger knows where an ancient weapon is located. And you know, Roger did have the egg on their ship already at that time, and soon after that moment, a storm rolled in out of nowhere and wiped out half of Shiki's fleet. So this has always been some of the best evidence, for me at least, that not only does Uranus have something to do with the weather, but it's probably also inside that egg. And we also know from Nami that weather and eggs go hand in hand, which only makes sense in One Piece, but regardless, I think that's all lining up. And to be clear, when I say it's a dragon, that's a pretty wide-ranging term. Like, we know Kaido's a dragon, but he also has a fish fruit, so he's a fish at the same time, and Shirahoshi is a mermaid, but her royal palace has a giant dragon on top, because fish and dragons are so closely linked. And I've been saying for a really long time that Pluton is a mole, and that's partially because mole in Japanese is Mogura, and Mogura also translates to Earth Dragon. So when Growth Stonks brings up things like a phoenix or a thunder duck from Strong World, I think those could be dragonified easily. So when I say that there's going to be a dragon inside that egg, I don't want everyone to think immediately like the most common depiction of a dragon. I'm talking like an Oda depiction of a dragon, which could be almost anything at this point. And then our third question, and the last one from the Discord, comes from Cymex749. Do you think Scopper knows how to beat the Gorosei regen if the Holy Knights have it? And now this is something that I talked about a little bit earlier as well, but I wanted to answer this one more directly because even in Egghead, we didn't necessarily learn the trick to beating the regen, right? We just saw that if you overwhelm them with such top tier Haki, like with Joy Boy's rope, then they all get sent back. But that's different than the regen, right? It's not like they actually died. And what if they weren't summoned to Egghead at all? But what if we went there and fought them in person like Sabo did? Would they still have the regen? I would argue yes, personally. So there's still a big question as to how you get past that. And so that means that we still should figure out the trick to that at some point. And if anyone would know, it should be Scopper or Rayleigh. Now, during Egghead, I was a believer that the trick was going to be tied to the ancient power source that Emeth used, or maybe those photonic gloves that let them hit holograms, but neither of those really came to fruition, so I guess we'll have to see. But alright guys, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to hit like and subscribe because we're going to keep these coming every single chapter. And if you want your questions answered in the next video, then make sure to join the Discord below. But until next time, later.